My name is David DiGirolamo, the sitting mayor of Union Township in Hunterdon County. In this episode of Breaking Bread in Union, we talk about a story, a true story, just screaming to be turned into the next Netflix binge watch. It's not on Netflix yet, but maybe one day. Not only is it true, but it happened here, on our very roads, in our backyards. It's the story of the Pattenburg Massacre, 4 dead, murdered bodies. It is one of the darkest chapters in our local history, occurring simultaneously with perhaps the greatest engineering feat of the moment, the construction of the then largest railroad tunnel along the eastern seaboard through the Jugtown Mountain. Though it's a Netflix series in weight, it very much has a law and order structure. It involves a crime and then a tension-packed court case. It's a story of construction and destruction, a story of racial hostilities and an anticlimactic courtroom drama with several dead and buried and no one held accountable. Today I sit down with Gordon Long, local author and the writer of The Winds of Midnight, the only published novel written on the subject. Folks from the area know about the tunnel that is tucked away in the woods on the fringe of town, but do they know the story that echoes from its walls? Today, we shine a light on and through that tunnel. We narrate it, we tell that story. So let's go. I'm excited to have this conversation. I've heard a lot about you, Gordon, from a handful of local residents who know you, who've heard you speak about yourself, about the Pattenburg Massacre, about the other books that you write and the topics that inspire you. This podcast, Breaking Bread in Union, and we've done this now for the last 2 podcasts. We have food that we brought from a local eatery. We did it the first 2 times. We've certainly done it a 3rd time. This food tonight, I don't think you've had anything from Cree Wine, have you?
No.
Okay, so you will tonight.
Very good.
So Chris Cree is the owner and the inspiration. He is the only master of wine in the state and one of only 57 people in the United States with that distinction. He opened Cree Wine Company in our Union Township. You knew where it was, at the old Perryville Inn, a historic site. They have a full menu, hundreds of wines by the flight glass, over 1,100 different wines and spirits to choose from. Wine Spectator actually gave the location the Award of Excellence for its wine program. It is a great and sophisticated addition to the township. I think it's been here for maybe 4 years or so. It's been really a wonderful inclusion. So tonight, I brought for you and some guests who are sitting around the room here at the studio some burrata with confit, tomato, micro basil, extra virgin olive oil, Maldon cheese sauce, and cracked pepper. If you're keeping score at home, it goes great with Provence rosé and crisp Italian whites. And Sicilian fried chicken. This is like my order of choice when I go there. Tender and flavorful, juicy dark meat marinated in brine. It's paired perfectly with medium-bodied reds like a Chianti and a Barbera Pinot Noir. Did you memorize all that?
Oh, I've got it down. I'm going myself right after.
So Gordon, I need not tell you this, but the story that we're going to be discussing today is fascinating on so many levels. First, the backdrop of the stage, of the theater that plays out, involves the Pattenburg community, and some of the landmarks exist still today, about 200 years removed from the actual event itself. Second, the tragedy and the crimes are in the context of really an extraordinary engineering undertaking, and it remains today. It's not used, but it remains today. Third, the story involves 2 races pitted against one another, the stage set by long-standing demographic animus, incredibly arduous work, and alcohol. Mm-hmm. In the aftermath, the resolution of the story is entangled with witnesses fearing persecution and truth being consequently tarnished. And finally, it's a story that happened long ago, but the essence of it is thoroughly relatable, perhaps even prescient to what exists or could exist in modern day. And hopefully we're going to talk about that. So there's much to discuss, much by which to be fascinated. And I also think there's much that we could possibly learn from it as well. So I'd love to dive into all of that. Sound good?
It does.
Thank you so much for coming, Gordon.
My pleasure.
I was really happy to get in contact with you. I'm thankful to my friend, our mutual friend, Marilyn Moss, for putting us together and for resurrecting this story for all of us and thinking through what we take away from it. I will share one other thing with you. I post a lot on Facebook and frequently community-oriented things. And I decided to take my kids to the inlet of the tunnel. We went through the old train tracks, and some people guided us as to what trees to look for and to get to the actual inlet. And I took a picture. My daughter took a picture of me right outside the hole there. And I posted it on Facebook, and I didn't expect much of any awareness or thought at all. It was by far the most viewed and liked post of any picture ever put on Facebook on that page. There's something about the story. There's something about trains in general and tunnels that attract people. I couldn't get over how much interest there was in the tunnel and indirectly in the story. So this is really neat to get a chance, not just in the written word, but also in speaking it out loud to give people a real understanding of what took place right around the corner. Before we get into the story, the outcome, the chaos of it all, I really feel compelled to start this conversation with you. So I recently learned, Gordon, that you and I have a couple things in common.
What are those?
Well, first, we both are Baptist Church Road boys.
Ah, yeah.
You used to live there.
I did.
I still live off there at the original Hunterdon Hills Playhouse property. And I think that my living at the original site has helped to propagate a very real, very keen interest in the history of the area and also sharing what I've learned. And second, we both appear to derive our inspirations from things that extend beyond our professional degrees and our careers. You are a 50-plus year resident of Hunterdon County. I'm gonna spurt out your resume if you don't mind.
No, please.
You have an undergraduate degree in history and a law degree as well. You practiced corporate contracts law for decades, sometimes working in cities in Europe, such as Paris and London. I've heard of them. Which likely have informed your understanding of global affairs. You've been a writer for almost just as long, and this included in the early days publishing short stories in literary publications and articles in business and travel magazines, and then moving on to the long form. You've written 6 books, soon to be 7, and all of them seem to be referencing historical events of some kind. So my first question for you is, what inspires you to write?
That's a good question. And I think I've been doing it so long, I probably can't recall what first made me do this. Being Irish, I guess, we're just known for long stories and storytelling. But I've always felt a need to get across some kind of a message, something that I found should be delved into a little bit deeper than often is the case with these stories. And my mother was a writer, not a professional, but I think I grew from that. I took that love of her words and what she was doing at the time, and that always seemed to be the thing that I wanted to do myself. But I recognized early on that I would probably starve before I would make enough money to do anything with it. And so, at my parents' urging, I went into a different career. I've had many different versions of it, but I've also enjoyed the law. And I appreciate what it does for people, and I'm also very much aware on how it can be used, as I might have said, to weaponize or to use it against people. Often those people are the ones that are least able to defend themselves.
Yeah. Were you always good at writing?
Well, that's kind of self-serving to say yes. I probably, I certainly didn't get a lot of failures at it, and I often would write in school. Everything you do is essays and writing and the things of that nature. But I was keeping a diary of myself, for myself, when I was still in my teens. And I like to think that over this many years, as I go back and look at some of my earlier work, I have 2 books that I've never even as much as taken out of the drawer. I wouldn't even attempt to get them published. So it is very much like training for a marathon. You have no expectation of placing first. When you first go out, you keep working at it until you think that the craft is what it should be.
I was not always, I believe in my heart that I'm a pretty decent writer, but I can tell you, I don't think I always was. I think this was an acquired skill for me. I was very scientific in my approach to writing, which didn't really lend itself to a good listener bandwidth or reader bandwidth. I think as I became more in touch with my own frailties and perhaps the frailties of others, I think I acquired a degree of empathy which lent itself to more accessible writing.
Well, I'm very impressed with your work.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that.
Almost jealous.
But listen, I have a strong affiliation for people who are great writers, of which I would include you. And it's just a really terrific thing to be able to do and to be able to share with others. And one of the things I love about it is the permanence of it. We can speak the spoken word, and perhaps it gets recorded, but the written word can be saved forever, and it outlasts us, our own lives, and gives us an opportunity to have an impact on people we'll never meet.
I agree.
Does that resonate with you?
It absolutely does. Yeah, it's written in stone, as they say.
Why do you choose the topics that you choose? You touched upon it, I think, a little bit, but can you flesh that out a little bit more?
I find that I can invest myself much deeper and apply much more energy when it involves something to do with history, but also the miscarriage of justice in that history.
Where do you get the most pleasure in writing? Where do you get the most gratification in what you write? Is it the research and the fruits of the labor that come as a result of it? Is it readership? Is it leaving something behind? What is it that gives you the greatest source of pride or joy?
No, that's a great question as well. I certainly enjoy the research.
Hey, I came prepared, man.
I see.
I got a writer in the midst. I want to ask these type of questions.
Obviously, the research is part of it, and I very, very much enjoy that. As a child, I was not taken to baseball games and sporting events. My parents were artists, painters, and readers, voracious readers. And I spent my childhood visiting historical sites and gaining an understanding of how important they are, not just as into the past, but as a roadmap as to where we're going. So the research is a lot of fun. It can be. It can be a little nerve-wracking. Sometimes it takes you places that you shouldn't be. And that's why I was interested to hear that you actually visited the tunnel. I know that you can find yourself escorted out rather abruptly. There seems to be some organization that appears out of nowhere and wants to know what you're doing there. There are times when it's very, very laborious. Writing is a discipline. Unlike the work that I did as a profession, where if you didn't show up to work, somebody was going to call you and say, "Where are you?" And you were rated by how well you were doing your job. If you don't get up every day and set a quota or a time or something, a schedule, it won't get done.
You're talking about writing
product, itself. Yeah. So that's the labor end of it. When it goes well, the characters just seem to come alive. And of course, in my case, I'm using real life people. So I have the advantage that in many cases, there is material, there's documents, there's transcripts that even give me an understanding of what the people were saying to each other. So that helps a lot. But there are times when you just hit that valley and nothing's happening, so you have to just persevere. The writing comes from rewriting. The first drafts are really nothing more than modeling clay. Yeah. That's it. Mm-hmm. And then the fun begins when you can go back and salt and pepper it and look at what you did and tear a lot of it out and add a lot. And then you come out with this product.
I'm pumped to talk about this story. So what compelled you to write about the Pattenburg Massacre?
Well, how I came across it, I was sitting one day reading the Hunterdon Democrat, a local newspaper, and in the very, very back pages, in a very, very small clip, was a mention of this story. Now, at the time, as you said earlier, I happened to be living just on the outskirts of Pattenburg, and I myself and many others that I was talking to had never really heard much about this story. And so that was the catalyst for what became a year's worth of research, maybe longer, a year's worth of writing, and the telling of a story that I thought really needed to be out there.
Why?
I think because it does have a lot of association with present day and the politics that we're seeing, and the desire for one group of people to just better themselves while they're fighting off those that just don't want them to rise up.
So you were intrigued by the story
I was.
fairly instantly. Mm-hmm. How did you do the research for this?
Well, again, I was fortunate that the subject had itself a lot of documentation that was left behind, not only in our local papers and in the transcripts of the trials, but it was interesting, as noted in this book, some of the major New York publications and papers sent reporters out into the field, and it began to get a following far in excess of the local people. So I spent many, many, many lunches in the New York Public Library. I worked in New York for McGraw-Hill, and with a pocket full of dimes for their microfiche machines, over time I began to get volumes and volumes of materials that have to be sorted through. And every publication, as it is today with newspapers in particular, or TV, there is often a political bias to it. So you have to recognize that in the editorials or in the writers that are working for a particular slant. And you got to make sure that you sift through all of that and constantly look at both sides of the argument. A lot of it's like detective work. And that's the fun part of it, trying to solve the answers to questions that aren't so readily out there to see.
And also, I feel like there has to be an additional allure to things that are not fully at your fingertips. There's, at least for me, there's something really neat about searching for things as opposed to things readily at your fingertips.
No, I agree.
I'd also say, too, that what you were referencing before, the perhaps inherent bias of sources, I would think that we're seeing that writ large these days. Perhaps it was to a lesser extent in the past. But what do you think about that? Do you feel like the sources from which you derived your information, were they more biased back in the day, or are they more biased today?
I think they're equal. I honestly do. I think that's human nature. I don't think anything is that different. My wife and other people in my life are constantly bringing up news stories and how can this happen and why does this happen? And the frankness of it is that it's been going on ever since the very beginning. Maybe in a larger scale. I think that media today allows us to be saturated with details, with data, and it's not always properly editorialized. So you need to be careful of what sources that you trust.
So let's break this up into three parts. This is my thinking, if you don't mind. So I want to talk about what happened in this story. I want to talk about how it resolved or didn't resolve. And then I'd love to talk to you about putting it all together and what we could possibly learn from it all. The name of the book is called The Winds of Midnight. When did you write this?
I began writing this book around 2011, 2012. So it was finally published in 2013.
All right, so almost 15 years.
Yeah, it seems that. Oh, wow.
So let's start with the sleepy days. Can you describe as best you can the village of Pattenburg in 1870? I travel down Pattenburg Main Street all the time. There are a lot of things that I see, and I just know, gosh, I don't know what it is, but I know it was something. Can you paint the picture for listeners as to what the scene was like pre-Industrial Revolution, 1870, right at the beginning days of a post-Civil War era.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an often overused cliche, but it truly was just a sleepy little village. There weren't that many people in the town. They were primarily farmers. There was no industry. One of the biggest productions they had going there were peaches. And that's one of the reasons that it had all of the basket-making businesses that were there. So there was nothing about Pattenburg that was unique or would have set the stage for something like this, other than the fact that there were certain individuals, industrialists, like Asa Packer. He was the owner of a large coal industries and railroads, and they decided that they would have a better profit margins if they built their own railroad and could haul their own coal out of the coal regions of eastern Pennsylvania to the shores along New Jersey and New York. And so that's what led them there to that particular place and time, was to construct what at the time was considered an engineering marvel of the ages, to go almost literally a mile from two directions and meet in the middle without being off by more than a couple of inches.
So before they started that, this community was not more than 200, 300 people, right?
That's it. Very small.
Fairly
town.
Anonymous.
Nope.
Off the beaten path. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, this was right around the time of Joe Gano, which is one of the roads in our township is named after Gano. He was I don't think he was the mayor, but he was the richest guy in town. I seem to remember that.
He was the owner of the only general store in business in that town.
Which was where? That was off Main Street, wasn't it?
It's right across from the church that's there now.
Yep.
Yes.
It's across the street, or it's on the same side?
Next to it.
Yeah.
So it's by the graveyard.
Do you know that they're repurposing that? They've turned that into a couple of residences. I actually walked through it.
Did you?
Yeah, about 3 or 4 months ago. The new owner was excited to show me, and I certainly was excited to be there. I mean, it just captures the essence that, oh gosh, this has been here forever.
It has. It's been stores. It's been different businesses. It's also been a private residence. He and his family lived upstairs.
Okay.
And downstairs was the general store. And he probably did a moderate business with the locals until the tunnel work started, and then he found himself right in the middle of the best place to be, the only store around, and he could bring in all the equipment that they needed and service all of the people that were working there with food and clothing and shoes and tools. And so he made himself a good bit of money there.
And he's buried at the Methodist Church, if I'm not mistaken, which is right next door.
Yes. Very common for that era. Most people didn't go more than 10, 15 miles from their place of birth to their place of death.
Yep. I actually feel like there's still some residents who are like that. They haven't left. I could think of at least 10 folks who've been there since they were born. I have one very close friend who walked to that church when he was 5 years old, and he's now 42, and no intention to leave that house. So it remains in some respects a sleepy village, though it has not been completely separated from the influx of modernization and the influx of a new America. Mm-hmm. So change came to town.
It did.
In the form of largely the Industrial Revolution.
Indeed, yeah.
Agriculture and agricultural markets seemed to switch over to industrial manufacturing. King Cotton being replaced by King Coal. Mm-hmm. Not Nat King Cole, but just King Coal. Yeah. And coal powered the railroads and the factories that were fueling our country's gains. How did this movement take place in Pattenburg?
I think by the arrival of Charles McFadden and his construction company and Asa Packard and his railroad, it's sort of like a little Switzerland. There was nothing there to bring people to it. There would be subsequently. There were businesses and even an amusement park, one of the first in this country. But that would come much later.
Yep. You're talking about Bellwood Park.
I am, yeah, which very, very few remnants of that still remains out
Maybe
there.
that's my next trip.
It could well be. You can go find the old concrete posts that were for the roller coaster. It had a very brief life because the influenza of 1918 or so really shut that park down. That, and they had beer halls, and the local minister and the temperance leagues did their very best to get rid of all of that.
So let's talk about the undertaking itself. You touched upon it before, but effectively, what was encumbering further progress in the area was this thing called the Jugtown Mountain.
Right.
And the company, the railroad company, effectively decided we're going to try to bore a hole through this large mountain. Mm-hmm. I believe the granite and the rock of this mountain was widely considered to be about the hardest material
you could come up
in the area. Yeah.
Yes.
And so you mentioned that there were 2 holes that were being dug at the same time with the hope of meeting in the center. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us why?
Well, as for why they did it from 2 directions simultaneously, that was operational efficiency. You can get a lot more crew in and work done if they're not stumbling over each other, which a mass amount of contractors sitting on one side of that mountain would forever be getting each other's way. So in this approach, he had 2 teams working simultaneously, and the work went a lot faster that way. Now, what he wanted to do was, as a good contractor would, is to get this done at the least possible cost so that he could make as much money as he could. And at that time in our history, there were 2 groups of people that you often went to when you needed to get something done that was a very laborious job and would accept a very, very hard amount of work and do it for virtually nothing.
And this was around 1870 or so.
It was.
Yep.
So at the conclusion of the American Civil War, what you had were 2 races of people. You had African Americans, blacks that had been enslaved for centuries, and now they were free, and they wanted a piece of what we always called the American dream. Likewise, you had immigrants coming here, again, not unlike today, who wanted a little bit better life for themselves. They were a country, Ireland, that was essentially a conquered nation. The English had taken it. And at the same time, they were suffering from a blight, the potato scourge. And it's interesting because if you look at statistics of that time, Irish people ate close to 15 pounds on average of potatoes a day. Meat was a very rare luxury. And the potato was a crop that could be grown just about anywhere. It mass-produced and reproduced itself, and it could feed a nation. But when that potato famine plague came through, they were starving, so they came here. Now, being in the a manifest destiny, the belief often mistaken by white people, they thought that they had an automatic right to be a higher rung on that ladder than anyone else, even those that were here before. And so you had a natural tendency between those 2. They're fighting for their own place in this country, and they weren't being given very much advantages, and that's the fight that just grew out of it all.
So 2 very disparate but very clear, desperate populations at the time. Now, the contracting company, no doubt the managers were aware of the potential for unrest between the 2 groups. If I'm remembering correctly from the book, there was a recent riot in New York City between the Irish and the blacks that helped to inform that feeling that there might be some inflammation if the 2 sides were to congregate too much.
Yeah. In fact, that was the New York draft riots. As a result of the Civil War and the need for manpower, Abraham Lincoln issued the first American draft. But there was a little catch. If you had $300, you could get out of it. You could hire or pay for someone else to take your place. But $300 could well be a man's 3-4 years worth of salary. So it was a rich man's war, not the first one and won't be the last, but those that had the wherewithal could keep their children out of the battle. And they believed, the Irish, as they arrived here, that this was one of the few opportunities they had to even make a living. They were practically brought off the boat and given uniforms and put into service. And because of that, there was a tendency by the Irish in particular to believe that this was a war over slavery. And it was the primary issue. But it wasn't one that they particularly had any investment in. They didn't really care how that came out. And so they began a riot in New York City, but elsewhere in Boston. And there were a lot of people killed over it. That's what brought this to a particular powder keg.
How did the managers of this railroad company strategically design the process in order to not have any hiccups? What was their strategy?
Well, they thought they were clever. And what they did was they had working camps. One were for the black workers and the other camps were for the Irish. And they could keep them separated, and they watched over them as they worked and primarily were able to forestall any clashes between them. But when it came to the eastern entrance of this tunnel, for some reason, I think it was the lay of the land in most cases, but they just weren't able to separate them geographically as wide as they had in places like further down by the Carter Farm or on the western tunnel. And it was inevitable.
Pattenburg was the eastern.
It was the eastern side of it. Mm-hmm. And there was where they were the closest at all times, both when they were working and when they were at rest.
And there were a couple of locations that they would go to on the weekends, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
One was the Pattenburg Hotel, which I think is the same as the Pattenburg House today, correct?
It is. In fact, it was built specifically for that project. It was a place for all of the industrialists that came out to see this project, for the people that were investing in this project. And the railhead got them pretty far, but then they would get into coaches and the likes. And so they built this hotel. And it became both a restaurant, tavern, and hotel, and it's still in existence today.
Well, I'll tell you something that's not in existence today was Marge O'Leary's Tavern,
That is true.
Which served as both a bar and a brothel, if I'm remembering.
That is true. And that is
At least I don't think it's still there.
No, it never existed, to be honest with you. That's a composite.
Oh, okay.
So sometimes in the telling of a story, there are little fragments of locations or people, and in order to propel the story, you create a composite. And so there were places like it, and no, there would not be any of those still today. But the very name Jugtown Mountain, it was originally known, it still is the Musconetcong Mountain by the American Indian.
Right.
Jugtown got its name because of the fact that there were all of these little stills and whiskey-making processes, and there were also clay factories that were manufacturing the jugs, but there were an awful lot of white lightning going on in those mountains. So the neighbors, the locals called it Jugtown.
So you have a couple of desperate populations working together on a very challenging undertaking. The company knew that they should separate them as much as possible. And they did to some extent, but not to a full extent. And so presumably they would meet. Perhaps while enjoying some alcohol on the weekends. Mm-hmm. And that became largely a powder keg for unrest.
Yeah.
So tell us about this and how that ultimately culminated.
Well, one particular evening, and this is in the records, there were two parties. There were Irish workers and the black workers, and they happened to come across each other by a mill pond that's not far from the Pattenburg house. And a little scuffle took place, and the blacks got the better of the Irish people at that time. There was a shooting. A man was wounded, and that began to fester. Now, they parted, and they went back to their respective camps, but that just kept going on. They sat and got drunker. They began to make a lot of threats. And in the middle of the evening, around midnight, the Irish workers charged onto the black settlement, the shacks and things there. And that's where the original clash started, right there by the tunnel.
And then what happened?
Well, they started to gather more and more people. The story is that the Irish workers sent messengers over the mountain to the western tunnel entrance where the largest Irish camp was, and either voluntarily or by coercion, they brought a lot of their own back to bolster up the numbers. And the blacks tried their best to hold off, and the contractors and the foremans, the guards, but they were just overwhelmed by this mass of Irish workers that began to chase them out of the area and down through the town.
So there were some casualties.
There were 4 in total deaths.
All black?
No. 3 of them were black workers. And they were caught out in the open by these marauding Irish groups and literally beaten to death. Now, Thomas Cole was the only Irishman that was killed in this fracas, and it's questionable as to who really did kill him. My theory is it was based on the money that had been paid out that Friday. And there were no banks. There were no places that these workers would put their funds. They would keep them in their bedrolls or in their tents or in their shacks. And in the midst of all of this, they discovered that they found a lot of that money. And my belief is, from the evidence that I was able to find, that Thomas Cole and another man got into an argument over who had the rights to the stolen money anyway. It wasn't theirs to start with. He was shot in the back of the head, so it wasn't a frontal confrontation that you would expect in a traditional fight. But they turned that to their advantage, the Irish did. They claimed that this was the work of the black workers that they were chasing to get even with.
So it was used as a lightning rod to incite the Irish, as well as perhaps maybe some of the residents
Indeed, yeah.
in the town.
Yes.
Can you describe for listeners the perhaps accidental involvement of village residents who, it sounds like, were caught in the crossfire of all of this and the manhunt that ensued that night?
Yeah, that's interesting as well, because there's no innocent parties in regards to the locals. There were those that would have had similar attitudes as the Irish did and probably joined in this. But to the larger extent, they were trapped. They were captive. They were stuck in the middle of this riot that was going on, and they themselves were being threatened. The Irish workers did not possess a lot of weapons other than the tools of their trade, so guns and shotguns and pistols, but they knew that that would be found in the houses of the people that they were going towards. And in one case, a man by the name of James Stockton, he had a house on the very outskirts of town heading, I think it would be east towards the encampment by the Carter farm, and they broke down his door, threatened him, and took his weapons away. So they were moving along down this road and stopping at places and reinforcing themselves. There's no real record as to how many of the locals participated, so I wouldn't want to paint a bad picture of them. They were stuck in the circumstances.
When I do bring this up to to some folks. Once in a while, I hear I hear them respond, "Oh, well, this is a controversial topic." There's a suggestion that the black workers were not entirely innocent; that perhaps they were antagonizing the Irish workers. Is there evidence for this?
Well, I think some of the strongest evidence is that they could have just backed away. They could have taken themselves out of the situation, but that's not what men do. And it's regardless of color. If you push people into a certain situation, they're gonna bite back. And certainly there was animosity, as I said earlier. These were natural enemies due to the economics and the politics of the time. And in that case, there were those that just said, I'm not going to take this. And they began to retaliate.
You're talking about the blacks or the Irish?
Yes, no, the blacks. Yeah.
So as to who started it probably still remains a...
We'll never really know for certain. Alcohol had a major part in it, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
Certainly.
So past his prologue with alcohol.
Yes.
So the drama didn't stop on the roads. Well, actually, let's talk about how did it end that night or that early morning?
I think it was a combination of the sun came up, and there's something about the dark and the night that makes people do things that they won't do in the day or in the light of the day. And they really just wore themselves out because there was, again, a lot of consumption of alcohol, and that was fueling all of this. And eventually McFadden and some of the locals did arm themselves and got enough manpower in there to separate these groups. But I think it just comes down to they had enough. They were done. And it just as quick as it began, it ended. And they went back to their respective camps as if nothing had happened.
Ultimately, the authorities found some likely culprits, likely assailants. Mm-hmm. How did that unfold? It didn't just end that morning. They were taken to task. They were brought to, I believe, the Flemington County Courthouse. And I know you love courtroom dramas. This became one.
It did. It did.
So walk us through how that went down.
Well, you were talking about people's names like Gano now being street names. And in Delaware Township, there's a street called Rittenhouse, and you might see it somewhere else. But Sheriff Rittenhouse was a very prominent figure in all of this. He represented the first legal or law that arrived on the scene. This was before the militia was sent in by the governor. And he had a very difficult task in front of him. First, he had to be able to get the people that had participated or that had witnessed it to begin talking, which they were being intimidated by the roaming gangs of the Irish that were still out there, threatening anyone that cooperated. And then he had to get these people across what is close to 12 miles of open turf, open territory. There weren't really a lot of roads from Pattenburg into Flemington, so he deputized a good number of people. My understanding
to me, that's just driving a health quest.
That's right. That's it. You jump in a car, you wouldn't think twice about it, but that's a day's journey by foot. And so he had a very difficult task of getting them there. But eventually, when things calmed down enough, there were enough good citizens that would point the finger at those people they saw doing what they saw. In all likelihood, the real agitators might well have been miles from there at that time, because when McFadden's contracting company the day or two after began to reassemble the teams, there was a great deal of absentee. There were a lot of people that weren't there anymore.
So they skipped town.
Oh, absolutely. But they did find a few that they had good evidence against, they thought, even witnesses. And they did take them down to Flemington and put them in the jail there awaiting trial.
And what happened in the trial?
That is very questionable as to whether or not justice was served there. What I found very interesting in defense of the prisoners, the ones that had been accused of committing these crimes, they had a very illustrious group of defense lawyers, not unlike the trials of O.J. Simpson, where if you have the wherewithal, you can hire the very best in the legal minds. So one of them was John Taylor Bird, who was actually a congressman out of New Jersey. And there were others that were from very reputable firms. And the question begs itself, these poor Irish workers that didn't have a dime to their names, who was it that sponsored all of that defense team? They couldn't have afforded it. Were they looking, the lawyers, for an opportunity to make the papers, to get a name for themselves? And that's still done today. You take on those cases that have the most celebrity, and you can enhance your career magnificently. And so on the contrast, you had lawyers like George Allen, who was nothing more than a local prosecutor, and he was really ill-equipped to handle the legal battle that was being done by these professionals. So that's a question that never got answered. Where did they get the money to fund their defense? And they had some of the best defense that money could buy.
Interesting. What was the verdict?
One by one, and with many witnesses. And there were witnesses, again, not unlike today, that had first made statements, swore to them, took an oath that they were telling the truth, that clearly pointed to the instigators, and they were these Irish people, or the Irish prisoners. But one by one, they seemed to either change their testimony or just up and disappeared. So at the end, unfortunately, you would expect a happy ending like a Hollywood story, but that was not the case. And I think that, too, is something that I wanted to point out, that we often believe that this kind of prejudice, this kind of injustice only took place in the South. But this is New Jersey. New Jersey was one of the last states to ratify the Emancipation Proclamation. There have been professors written some very, very good work that would suggest that New Jersey, being an agricultural state, was very pro-Southern in its attitudes.
Interesting. Are there bodies? There are bodies buried by the railroad tracks. What is the prevailing notion?
Well, as it explained in the book, it's interesting because this is long before the era of workers' comp and health plans and anything of that nature. And neither group, the contracting company that hired these people, certainly not Asa Packer and his board of directors of the railroads, felt any obligation whatsoever to take care of these dead. In the case of the 3 blacks that were killed, they would have had to get family. Many of them came from Virginia and states lower, and would have had to, at their expense, transport the dead back, and that wasn't going to happen. There was a great deal of racial divide still, even in those days, even in the North, that would not have permitted black men to be buried in white cemeteries. But interestingly enough, Thomas Cole, his body ran into a similar problem. They attempted to bury him in a Christian cemetery up in Hampton, and the priest that
Which
managed
I think still
the church,
exists.
It still exists.
The church.
It does. But he is not there. Where he went, I don't know.
I think it's the Norton Church.
I believe you're right.
Yep.
Yes, it is. It went by a different name back then, but it's still there, and so is the graveyard. But long and the short of it is, neither of the organizations that were creating or working on this project felt an obligation to take care of them. And so the story is that they were buried along the rail line that now is abandoned. It's just fields, and no one ever found them.
Wow. A true mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Mystery in the conclusion and a mystery in the story itself. So the tunnel was built.
It was.
It was completed in 1875.
Yes,
which
it was
I think
open
is
that year.
5 years
Mm-hmm.
it took. How did Pattenburg change?
Rather radically, because now it was a rail stop. And like highways would later make small invisible towns accessible, and the populations would change, not unlike when they finally opened up Route 78. The entire area of Hunterdon County bloomed with people. So Pattenburg experienced a lot of sudden growth. It was so busy, that rail line, that by 1929, the railroad came in and built another set of tunnels so that they would have tracks going one way and tracks going the other. The single-lane tunnel, the original, was no longer capable of keeping up with the freight traffic that was going back and forth. There was the Pattenburg Hotel. It became a featured stop. There were dignitaries that rode in at the opening of the tunnel, senators and congressmen. I even believe one president came to see it. It was, as I said earlier, quite an engineering feat. So it was something like the Hoover Dam. It attracted people. And then long about the turn of the century in the early 1900s, in order to get more passengers on that track, on that rail, less, not just freight, Asa Packer and his board of directors and a few others opened up one of America's first amusement parks, and that was Bellwood. Now, Bellwood had its excitement, and it had its rides, roller coasters and love tunnels, but as I said before, it had a beer garden. And that would have been fine if the people that drank and visited that beer garden stayed there. But there would be the curious, and they would want to go see, well, what's off in this little town, and they would go staggering around, so the story goes. And one of the local ministers in that church and the Temperance League, which there were a lot of them back then, decided that this was just not going to work. It was not what this town wanted. And so they were looking for any reason to shut it down. And then along came the Spanish influenza. And much like COVID did, it shuttered everyone. There weren't as many people that were out in the open, and the park just went bankrupt. And over time, pieces of it just got dismantled, reused elsewhere. And I understand that the only remnants of it is a couple of concrete footings from the old roller coaster and some postcards that you can find on eBay commemorating this amusement park, long before Six Flags.
It's amazing. I think about present day, and we're this last part of the conversation. I'd love to extrapolate to the present day and possibly the future, but it just seems like it doesn't matter what era we're talking about, including today. There's always a feeling that not in my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of what you're describing, it was people carousing, having too much fun, and the township leaders then at the time trying to put a stop to it. And ultimately, the actions that they took had an effect on ultimately what is there today. So no Bellwood Park anymore. I think it only had a 12-year run. And you can almost feel the same heartbeat in hot topics today, like affordable housing, where there's a very clear notion of we need to protect our township. We can't have a certain demographic come into town. Also, industrial development, where we're not the only municipality dealing with the perhaps threat of overdevelopment, sprawl, warehouses. These are things that perhaps reflexively the established residents reject, are allergic to.
Right.
It's about protection of their homes.
Yeah, there's two interesting factors that come into play here, and that is that first of all, it's ironic that people come and they love what they see, and they love the country living and the safety, but the very first thing they want to do is make sure nobody else comes. And so there is this point in time when you want to stop the very building that attracted you here in the first place. And that is very typical of today. Everyone wants the conveniences. Everyone wants their Amazon deliveries and overnight shipments and the likes. But warehouses are now the big topic. They don't want them.
But the warehouses for many of us are the direct result of our purchasing behavior patterns. So
you complain about trucks on the highway.
But I didn't have Bellwood Park on the township committee agenda over the last 4 years, so they probably had it a little bit tougher than me, or maybe not. So before we go to the last part, just wanted to talk about, are there any memorials or historical markers or unmarked graves to commemorate and honor the four men who passed?
None.
None
to my knowledge. Some of the participants, like Mercy Carter in the book, her grave is there by the old Baptist church. That's an interesting story in itself. The story is that there was a church raffle, that the money got misappropriated, disappeared, and it created a fraction between the congregation, and eventually it split, and the church fell in disuse and became abandoned. But there is no memorial. No, there are nothing to even commemorate the event in itself, let alone the participants.
Do you know of any Black-led organizations or leaders of abolitionist groups who tried to seek justice for the victims?
Not to my understanding, no. Again, even though it was covered by some of the big city papers as they were known by then, other events would come along. The very next year, in June of 1876, you had with General Custer, and that was our centennial.
Yep.
And that took all the wind out of any stories floating around about Pattenburg and the likes, but nothing that I'm aware of that any group, no pardons, nothing was ever further done about it. It just got swept under the covers of history, and every now and then it gets brought back up, and I thought that book would help do that.
Hey, maybe this podcast does the same thing.
I would hope that. I would indeed.
So we spent a lot of time talking about the differences of opinion, to say the least, between the Irish and the Blacks. Were there ever any aspects of solidarity between the two groups, or was it largely separated based on race?
It was the latter. There was never any solidarity. No. I'm a Freemason, and for the longest time, if Blacks wanted to have their own lodges, they could, but they were not permitted to become members of the white lodges. That's no longer the case. But that consistent desire to separate it from each other, Blacks began to get political power. They began to get invested in the infrastructure. But it would be a long struggle for them, all the way into the 1960s and beyond, and one could argue even today. Irish, they began to manipulate the local governments. They became ward bosses in cities like Boston and New York. They took the jobs, the civil jobs that no one wanted. And that's why in Hollywood you still have the stereotypical fire chief is Irish, or the police chief, he's Irish, because that's really what they were. These were jobs nobody else wanted to do. But because they were allowed to be given these positions, they
positions
used
of power and authority.
They became the authority.
Interesting.
And then along came other immigrant groups, and that positioned the Irish and the Germans and the Welsh to a higher level on that ladder, or the social ladder. You had Italians and those people who then had to go through the same process.
It's almost like fraternity pledge tasks.
Very much so. Yes.
So bringing this to present day and perhaps the future, what can we learn from this tragedy, this historical event? What is our education on this?
Well, that's the key word right there, education. And it's that will help us to understand why we do what we do, and maybe, hopefully, one day stop doing it. As I said to you, Abraham Lincoln was quoted as saying, "History is prologue." As a historian, people will often ask me why. Well, it's just old, cold facts and figures, dead people. No, actually, it is a roadmap. It tells you where we came from, which is important because it tells us where we're going. We would like to believe, and we do, more often than not, learn from our mistakes. But the same human elements, the same human emotions will always come back to work against that advancement.
Or do we learn? Do you feel like we learn?
I do, but we do it begrudgingly.
So you wrote me something a few days ago in preparation for this conversation that we were having, and one of the things that I found interesting about what you wrote me was the difference between facts and the truth. Can you touch upon that?
Yeah, they're words that are often interchanged, and there is a belief that that's not necessarily the way you should look at them. Facts are like bricks, as I said. They're not bendable. They are what they are. They do not change. But what truth is very subjective. And it's what we take with those facts and the argument that we want to structure. So bricks are good. You can use facts to create anything. If truth comes into play, it's more of a personal viewpoint, and we will sometimes take those facts and dispose of those that don't fit our argument or leverage those that do. And what we call truth is too often just viewpoint. Everyone has a truth, but it's not always the same. But facts are undeniable. They do not change, but they can be obscured and hidden through truth.
You mentioned in the very beginning the concept of weaponization of the law. Let's talk about that a little bit. How do you see it, especially given your background in the law?
That is interesting, but of course, it's used that way, and it always has been.
What are some examples?
Well, if we want to talk about current affairs, and again, it's a matter of where your political beliefs fall, but President Trump has long insisted that they were using the courts and the judges and lawsuits and the likes to basically wipe him off the map, just to obscure anything he was trying to do. And so, yes, you look at in the case of blacks in the South at the post-Civil War, we have Jim Crow laws. And all of them were done under the banner of separate but equal. But there was no truth in that. That's not the facts. We use that to arm ourselves and withhold from those people their rights to the same things that we would fight hard to keep for ourselves.
It's crazy, right? Because the law can start with good intentions and then end up getting steered in directions that were perhaps, hopefully, never fathomed, right? We hope that the law wasn't used as a manipulation tool, but one thing that comes to mind currently is, once again, affordable housing. This started in 1975 with the Mount Laurel decision, which I think most people, regardless of political party, would agree was a reasonable judgment, and that was that it was not lawful to ban someone or a group from a particular municipality based on their wherewithal.
Or their race.
Their financial wherewithal. Exactly. Well, I think Mount Laurel was specifically about
It
income,
was.
but
That's where affordable housing all stems from.
and so started what I think presumably was a well-intentioned law that was put in place. You fast forward 50 years later, we are one of 500 plus municipalities that are dealing with the looming threat of too much affordable housing being handed to us by mandates, thoughts from the state of how many units we are asked to bring to our township, and they have no consideration. They are indifferent to whether or not we have the infrastructure in place to accommodate that. So what we're left with as a township is struggling mightily to ward off the state without being such a stick in the mud that we receive the lashings from the state, which can happen. But now we're also faced with objections on our numbers by the New Jersey Builders Association,
Of course.
which is not a disinterested party.
No.
So 1975 started this long walk of we can't really reject people based on their income status, and what we're left with 50 years on is a political action committee with a vested interest in continuing to build and build and build with no real regard or concern for the residents who live in those municipalities. So the law was intended to protect. Ultimately, it's the source of perhaps a great deal of anxiety, not just in our municipality, but in others throughout the state.
No, I agree, David. I absolutely agree. And it's not unlike the bounty that you could pay to get out of the Civil War duty, $300. Though there was a time here in Hunterdon in particular where we attempted to get our Mount Laurel obligations sold to other townships by way of paying off those that felt the need to have that here. We would simply say, put them elsewhere, and we will give you a lot of money.
Politics.
Indeed.
Power.
Yeah.
Any point of view on the obvious elephant in the room, which is racial divide? I mean, it runs through the fiber of this story. Have things changed?
I can only see it from my perspective, and that's obviously that of a white man. I do like to think that, yes, I'm 70-something years old. I lived through the Civil Rights era. I've lived through the Vietnam War era. So I have seen advancements.
Don't say the Civil War.
No, no, not that one. So I have seen advancements, but is there room for more? Absolutely. I think that in some ways, what we have is a situation where it profits people to hold on to that prejudice. But I really don't know. I'd like to think that, yeah, we have made a good deal of progress, but more to come.
And yet, I don't feel like people want to listen anymore. Do you get that sense too?
Yeah, it's a subject that doesn't want to get talked about. And just like that book, or the reason for having written it, it's classic. It's something that it's uncomfortable. We don't know where we stand on this issue many times. As individuals, we don't feel it, but as groups, we seem to promote it. Here's a perfect example right in this room. It's multi-racial. People are getting along. We live together. But when it's to someone's advantage, they'll bring that thing up again. And there we go.
I think this is one of the true cancers in our society today, is the entrenchment of opinion. And no one, there are very few people in my radius that truly strike me as open to listen, to challenge their own points of view, consider someone else's, and perhaps reform their their conclusions. That entrenchment creates an environment in which there's no, it's at least to me, and I don't mean this in a thoroughly discouraging way, but it strikes me as something that we need to break that glass. I wish that that people would learn from the mistakes, as we discussed before, and actually figure out a better way for all of us, because we're all going through this crap together.
We are.
And we don't get a second shot at this. I had the opportunity to, and it was truly exclusively having read your book. I write a newsletter or a magazine for our township, and I love the story because my buddy, 92-year-old Doug Martin, I sat at his, and I'm going to try to get him either here or I'm going to go to his place, and we're going to sit in front of a couple microphones and talk about the history of the township. He's one of those birds where you need to take as much as you can from this man, because there's just so much reference material. It's like the Union Township microfiche is talking to Doug Martin.
Right. And
I was talking to him about his life and about the Van Sickles Tavern in which he lives and in which he was born. And he said, "Well, did you ever hear about the Pattenburg Massacre?" And I'm like, "No, I don't even know what that is." And he shuffles to the library and he grabs your book.
Oh.
And this book is stained by numerous coffee mistakes from Doug. And he said, "Give it back to me, please." I haven't yet, but because I use it as a reference material for me. But it was he who introduced me to the story. All I knew about the Pattenburg Tunnel was that lots of ATVs go through it, at least back in the day.
Yeah.
It was almost like the boogeyman. I mean, very few people know where it is. The long-time residents know where it is.
They do.
And there's lots of beer bottles that are around that tunnel to make it clear that people know what's there. Including, discouragingly, my son, who told me a week ago that he went fishing right outside the tunnel, and I've since reprimanded him on that. But anyhow, this gave me such a wonderful gift of learning something about our history, about our township that I'd never fully understood, and there was a real irony to something. It kind of struck me as I read your book, and I wrote effectively a paraphrased 4-page piece in the magazine. I just want to share with you one paragraph from it that I really got from what you wrote. And I wrote, "And yet, there it lingers in its starkness, particularly when one stares up at the marvel of the tunnel's stone facade and the pinhole of light barely visible through the circumscribed blackness of the hollow. It's the incredible irony of its obvious juxtaposition. How can something so remarkable, so noteworthy as a feat of collective team-based construction be associated directly with the frailties of man and its unfortunate occasional underbelly of destruction? The irony jolts, it grounds, and it informs. Our present and our future can be understood through the lens of our history, the impossible tunnel that connects us to our past, and the light on the other side." That's really what I got from your story.
I like that. I very much do.
And I think it's so applicable to our current conversation that we can be so bloody constructive, right? We can achieve feats 20 years ago never deemed possible. And yet there's just this underbelly of destructiveness. Families not communicating anymore as they once did because they don't want to rub their aunt the wrong way or their sister the wrong way. And we've all gone to our respective corners. So in a period of amazing construction, there's also spiritual, physical destruction as well. That irony persists. It occurred in 1870 and it still occurs today. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I very much agree with that synopsis. I do. I think the frustrating thing for me is many times as I've talked about this story, told this story, I still remain frustrated that I'm just not hitting the marks, that I'm not really conveying what needs to be said and understood. There are those.
Why do you say that?
I have had people where they will read this. You asked me once whether or not anyone's ever objected to it. Fortunately, I can say no, but with one exception. I was doing a reading once, and after that, a man approached me, and he said, "You're Irish, are you not?" I said, "Yes, I am." "Why would you write a book like that?" Simply because it has nothing whatsoever to do with me being Irish, or me being German, or me being English, or me being white, or me being black. It's human nature that justifies whether or not we're going to make any changes with the way we live with each other. And I just feel that it falls short sometimes of getting that message across. So that's why I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity that you gave me today. And hopefully word will go out a little further than it has in the past. And it'll do something good.
Hey, we're just starting, man. Don't give me too much credit. We're still...
It'll do some good.
Yeah. I very much appreciate you sitting here and telling the story again. It's a story that is certainly worthy of being told. Is there anything that we missed, or do you feel like we and you captured it as well as we could have?
Well, no, nothing I can think of, as I said, though. Perhaps with this podcast, there'll be an opportunity for more to read this book. And similar books that I've written, they have pretty much the same story. It is about a group of people that are always downtrodden and not given their rights by another group of people who feel justified in doing what they're doing.
The book is called The Winds of Midnight. The terrific author is G. Gordon Long. He was our guest today on the podcast, Breaking Bread and Union. I'm super ecstatic to have talked to you, Gordon. The culprits, the victims, they're all dead. It was 150 plus years ago. But the story and the ramifications, the consequences are very much alive. And what a neat little piece of our history. It's a dark chapter, but it's also an elucidative chapter as well. So thank you so much for being part of this and informing our community. And you come back when you do your seventh book.
All right.
Just make a plug for Union Township or our area, and we'll be sure to bring you.
I will indeed.
All right, and enjoy Chris Cree's Sicilian chicken before you go.
All right. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.